Now I'm so excited to introduce to you the daughter of Esther Krinitz, Bernice Steinhardt. Welcome, Bernice.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to share some of my mother's art with you and some of her life story. It looks like those of you who have seen the exhibit at the Visionary Art Museum will recognize the backdrop, which appears as though I'm actually in the gallery, but I just have a really good photograph because I'm actually in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, to be precise. So it's really fantastic. I saw someone from New Mexico, from Canada, from Chicago. So this is really a global, if not national, just a global enterprise. And it's really warms my heart to be able to share it with all of you. So before we get into the specific images, let me tell you a little bit about my mother. My mother grew up in a little tiny village in the center of Poland called Mniszek. And she was 12 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland and they came straight to her village. I should actually acknowledge that today is my mother's birthday. She would have been 97 today, but she didn't even come close. She died when she was 74. But it would have thrilled her to know that her art and story has drawn so much appreciation from outside her family. Anyway, going back to my mother's history, she was 12 when the Germans invaded Poland and came straight to her village. And they occupied it for 3 years until October 1942, when they ordered all the Jews of her village and the surrounding area to report to a train station in a nearby city. But my mother refused to go. She didn't know exactly what was going to become of them, but having lived under German occupation for 3 years, she felt desperate to do something else. And so she said goodbye to her family. She took her next youngest sister, Manya. She was 15, and Manya was 13 at the time. And they said goodbye to their family, and they never saw them again. So my whole life, I grew up with my mother's stories of her childhood and her survival. Unlike maybe most other Holocaust survivors, my mother, who couldn't speak of their experiences, my mother couldn't keep from speaking of her experiences. And so there wasn't really a time in my life when I didn't know my mother's stories. But when she was about 50, she decided that she wanted me and my sister to see what her home and her family looked like. She had never been trained in art. She actually didn't even know how to draw, but she could sew anything. So she took a piece of fabric, a large piece of fabric, and sort of sketched in her house and her family members. And this was the first picture that she made. If you could go to the first slide, Becca. And this piece is actually quite large. If you can see it in the background of my image, it's about 4 feet hanging on the wall. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And so here she remembers, this is a beautiful day before the war. She remembers coming up the hill to her house, carrying water from the river. Her sister Manya is at the top of the hill. Her father and mother and her 2 little sisters are in front of the house, and her brother is standing by the horse and wagon. And she said, "We were all so happy then." Next slide. So after she finished that first picture, she immediately set to work on a second picture. She gave the first one to me since I was the older daughter, and she made this companion piece for my sister. And here she recalls the farmers coming in from the fields, walking on the road in front of her house. And she and her sisters and brother are down by the river, uh, enjoying themselves with the cows grazing by the side of the river and the ducks and the geese. And you can see her braids actually bobbing on the surface of the water. And this picture, she completely filled in with stitches. There isn't one uh, uh, one piece, one inch that isn't filled in with. It felt like she had done what she wanted to do. And she was very pleased with the way the pictures turned out. But then about 10 years later, well, at this point, my kids, her first grandkids came along, and she was very busy making things for them. My mother, at the same time, she and my father had moved from Brooklyn to Frederick. They had a clothing store, Esther's, on North Market Street in Frederick. And so she was busy getting the store established, and making things for my kids. But then she decided to go back to these memory pictures. So if we could have the next slide, please. What I'm showing you now are the pictures organized in chronological order of events, but she didn't create them that way. She created them in what I call a psychological order. So as I go through these slides, you'll notice that some of them are much more sophisticated than others uh, because by that time she had already learned perspective and some other techniques. And so those really sort of stand out from the others. Um, Here, this is also before the war, a memory of the last Passover that they had in her village of Nishik. And here she remembers the women of the village would gather in the house of Muttle, the shoemaker. You can see the boots hanging on the right side of the screen. And because he had a big oven. And so he and his son would bake the matzahs that the women of the village would make for their own families, each for their own families. And she remembered her mother, who's standing in the back of the scene. She was very proud of her mother because her mother made the best matzahs in Nishik. None of them had to be discarded because they rose. It was considered not kosher for matzahs to rise at all. They had to be quickly made and quickly baked. One thing I wanted to point out in this picture, the fabric that she used for the curtains, she was really pleased to have found that fabric. She was always on the lookout for fabric that she could use in some way to to convey what was happening in these scenes. And so this fabric looked just like the curtains in Muttle's house as she remembered them. But there's a lot of stitching. You'll notice the basket in the front where the baked matzahs went is filled in with woven, with a kind of weaving stitch. Next slide, please. Now, this is September. This picture takes place in September of 1939. Right after the Germans arrived in her village, and patrol, you might say, of German soldiers who were coming into the village. And she knew they would go right by her grandparents' house, which was at the entrance to the village. So she and a couple of friends ran to her grandparents' house. And while they were there, they watched as one of the soldiers dismounted from his horse and pulled her grandfather, who had been on the steps of his house, they pulled him off and cut off his beard because they knew that he was Jewish. Only Jewish men wore beards at that time. So having a beard was a sign of his being Jewish. And so they cut it off. He cut it off with his sword as a major indicator of disdain and disrespect. And this was how the war began for my mother, watching her grandfather treated this way. Before we go on to the next one, I just want to point out to you, you may have noticed in the previous picture of Passover, it had a very vivid blue border. My mother used the border colors to distinguish time periods. I've only shown you this one picture from before the war, but there were several. And there are also pictures that she did from after the war. And they all used some other color, green or blue, and white in one case. But all the pictures that took place during the war, which was the majority of the pictures, she used black borders on them. Next slide, please. This is now in almost a year later, in July 1940. As I mentioned before, the Germans came in and they occupied the village. And so people were allowed to live in their homes, but their lives were really quite disrupted. My mother, and of course, there was some degree which worsened over time of people, Jews specifically, being terrorized or harassed. So, but this is a different kind of scene. My mother had heard that there was a dentist in the German camp. And one day she developed this terrible toothache. And she decided she was going to go and seek help from the dentist. But she knew she couldn't go as herself because she couldn't speak for herself because her Yiddish accent in German would have given her away as Jewish. So she got a Polish friend to go with her. And her friend said, my sister, she taught her to say in German, my sister has a toothache. So here she recalls the dentist pulling her tooth, after which he gave her a piece of chocolate presumably for having been a good patient. And my mother, when she would tell this story, she was really shocked at the nerve that she had had. When she went home to tell her mother, she hadn't told her mother what she was going to do in advance because she knew her mother would forbid her. But she was desperate because she was in pain. So she went without telling her mother, and it wasn't until after she got home that she told her mother. And her mother was shocked that she had had the nerve to do it, just as my mother was shocked when she would tell the story that she had had the nerve to do it. But she was, as I said, she was desperate to relieve her pain. And it was kind of a, a, a presage to what she later went on to do to save her life. Next slide, please. So this is now a beautiful day in June of 1941. By this point, the Jews were no longer allowed to own livestock, which was a terrible blow in her family. Her father was a horse trader. He used to travel around the countryside buying and selling horses, and her mother used to raise poultry to sell at the market. So at this point, or by this point, Esther and her sister Manya started working for neighboring farmers, Poles, as farmhands. And here on this beautiful day in June, the two girls decided to take the cows they were tending over to the good pasture near the Vistula River. And when they got there, my mother realized that they were next to this labor camp. Before the war, it had been a prison camp. They used to bring prisoners there to rebuild this earthen dam that would get flooded and washed out every spring. But once the Germans came, they turned this into a slave labor camp for young Jewish men and boys. And as my mother looked through the trees, she could see how these men and boys were being treated. And one, after they grew too tired too exhausted to work anymore, she showed one who was being led, a boy who was being led into the birch forest and shot. And my mother recalled that while they were there, they just kept hearing shots. So afterward, she and Manya took their cows and went home. Now, the pictures that my mother did, all of them were so beautiful. And I was always so amazed to see what emerged from her imagination and her stitching. But this one I felt was truly awesome. And I use that word in its original sense. I was just awed by how my mother captured the experience of war from the perspective of one of its victims. On the one side, life continued. She recalled this beautiful pastoral scene of these two innocent girls and the lushness of the fruit and the flowers. And when you see this close up, you can see that every blade of grass is a separate stitch. And on the other side, there's no color. It's almost devoid of color and devoid of the peacefulness and serenity on the right side of the picture. It's sort of a frantic scene of brutality and terror. And in this one image, she captured the duality of the experience of war, the beauty alongside the terror and brutality. When I showed this picture to a group of fourth graders, I asked them what they thought of it, and one boy raised his hand and he said, "This picture shows me that there's a thin line between good and evil," which is exactly what my mother was intending to show. Next slide, please. This is now a year or so later. This is the morning of October 15th, 1942. The Jews had been ordered from Nishik, her village, and the whole surrounding area. They had all been ordered to report to the train station in the nearby city of Kashnik. And the night before, and they were told that anyone who was still in their house by 10 a.m. on that day would be shot. So the night before, my mother wept and pleaded with her father to think of somebody that she could go to, a friend of his in another village, since he knew so many people, so many farmers in the area. She had the idea that she could go to work for a friend of her father's, just as a farmhand, just as she had been working. And he finally came up with a name of Stefan, a friend of his in the village of Dombrova. And so the next morning, here she is, and she wanted Manya to come with her. Manya didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with the family. But their mother finally told her, "Manya, go with Esther." And so she did. And here they are saying goodbye. And you can see this is one of the earlier pictures. In fact, she said this picture was the most difficult one of all that she that she made. Not so much technically, but just emotionally, because she was recalling the last time that she saw her family. And you can see that it really lacks perspective. It's very two-dimensional. And you can see how much she learned over the next few years. And you'll see it particularly in the next picture. Next slide, please. So that picture was one of the first pictures that she did. This is one of the last pictures that she did. And this is the scene from actually from the perspective of her parents. Her mother had hired a neighbor to take Manya and Esther to Stefan's house in Dombrova. And you can see in the background the two girls being led away by the neighbor. And they're already out of the picture almost. And the focus is on her parents and the rest of her family in the wagons. Her brother is standing, her two little sisters are already in the right-hand wagon. Her brother is standing alongside. Everyone has said their goodbyes, and now they're going. So she actually is remembering this from imagining it from her parents' perspective. She wasn't witnessing this scene through her own eyes. But it was something so powerful that she felt she had to return to. And you can see at the same time how much she learned since that earlier picture. It's a much more, I mean, she learned perspective, but it's also a more complex composition. Next slide, please. So the neighbor took the girls to her sister's house, and she told them to wait there for her, and she went off. And they were waiting and waiting, and Esther started getting very nervous because at that time, there was a bounty on Jews. So if you turned in a Jew, you could collect some kind of reward, sugar or kerosene or something. And so my mother grew worried that the neighbor was going to turn them in. And so she took money and the two of them left. And they came back to the road where all the Jews were on their way to Krasnik, to the train station. And there they met up with their cousin Dina, who was walking with her baby. And once they saw Dina, Manya just wanted to stay with her because she just wanted to find her parents and her family again. So at this point, though, my mother realized they were getting close to Krasnik, and she just didn't want to go on. And she started pulling Manya off the road to go to Stefan's house in Dombrova. And Manya didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with Dina. And it wasn't until Dina told her, Manya, go with Esther, that she listened. And I've always said that my aunt survived because she listened, and my mother survived because she didn't. So next slide, please. So two of them left the road and they made their way on their own to Dombrova, to Stefan's house. And here you can see he's standing in the doorway of his house, and the two girls just fling themselves into his arms, and they tell him, we're Hersch's daughters, please help us. And he takes them in and reassures them and puts them up in his attic where you can see they're stringing tobacco leaves. And after a couple of days, when they came down for breakfast, my mother could see that he was sending them away. Their baskets were packed and he was going to turn them out. And indeed, he did. He told them, my dear children, everybody in Nishik knows that you're here. And if the Germans come, they'll kill me, they'll kill you, they'll burn down my farm. You have to leave. So out they go into the pouring rain. until finally they came to an area of woods, and they waited there till the rain stopped and the sun came out, and they hung up their boots to dry. You can see them in the trees. And this is where my mother realized that they could not survive as Hirsch's daughters anymore. And so she made up this whole story that they were from another town on the other side of the Vistula River, called Chisov. And they came from a family that had been displaced from their farm. The Germans had displaced them and given their farm to the so-called Volksdeutsch, or ethnic Germans. They were Germans who had been living in Poland for a while, and so the Germans confiscated Polish land to give to these Volksdeutsch. So my mother's story was that she and Manya had been separated from their family and they were looking for work. And with that story, they went to the next village and the next village, where people would only take them in if they could show them papers. So, of course, they had no papers to prove who they said they were. Maria and Josefina Grochowiecka were the names my mother made up. And so they had to keep going until they came to the village of Grabówka. Next slide, please. And there, my mother found work. And there, people did not ask them for papers. They were willing to take them as they were. My mother found work. She went to live with this elderly couple. The wife was infirm and the husband needed a lot of help around his farm. And my mother was a great housekeeper. She baked, she cooked, she baked, she took care of the animals, and she put in this garden. And here one day, another beautiful day in June, these two German soldiers walked right into her garden, were trampling her plants, her strawberries, and they tried to engage with her, to talk to her. And my mother just hung her head down and pretended that she didn't understand what they were saying. And here you see on the left, her farmer, who she called dziadek, which is the Polish word for grandfather. He came out to see what was going on and watch after her. When all of a sudden, the bees that the farmer kept, that dziadek kept, and you see their beehives in the back, the bees came out of their hives and started swarming around the soldiers until they just drove them off. And the soldiers couldn't understand why they weren't stinging anybody else, just coming after them. So my mother she was amused when she would tell the story, but it was also kind of a miracle that the bees came to save her when no one else could. And you can see here again, just go back for a second, Becca, how gorgeous this scene is. Again, the field in which the beehives were placed, the grass there, every single stitch, every single blade of grass was a separate stitch, and all the beautiful flowers and trees growing fruit. And when you see these close up or in person, the strawberries, you can see the incredible handwork that went into making this the beautiful piece that it is. Next slide, please. So the Germans the Russians were pushing the Germans back. This is now 1944, and the tide of war had turned, and the Russians were now advancing from the east and pushing the Germans back into Germany and liberating all these towns and villages along their way. So after they came through Grabovka, where my mother was living, she went back to her village, to Nishik, to see if anyone from her family had come back as well, if they had returned. And not only were they not there, but no one in the village knew what had happened to the Jews. One neighbor told her she thought maybe they were taken to this concentration camp in Lublin, which a big city not terribly far from their village. Um, and yeah, that her family perhaps had been taken to Majdanek, this camp. So my mother left Nishik and went off in search of signs of her family. And you can see her in her bright yellow dress at the gates to the camp. And you'll notice that this was in August, and she included even this scene of incredible horror. She still included these beautiful flowers at the entrance to the camp because that was what was growing. It was August and flowers were blooming. And as she stepped through the gate, uh, then she saw what lay on the other side. And you see her in her yellow dress. I always thought she looked like Dorothy on the road to Oz, this innocent girl. And she walked through the gate, and there the Russians had liberated this camp. And so the Russian soldiers there took her on a tour of the camp, and they showed her the gas chambers and the crematorium. And at the top of the picture, this field of giant cabbages that were growing on a bed of human ash. And this is in actuality, the camp is vast. It's spread out over a very, very big area. And so my mother had to compress what she saw there into this one frame. And after she got a tour of the camp, she joined the Polish army, which was then under Red Army, Soviet Army command. And she was 17 years old. And with the army, she went to Germany. Next slide, please. And here she is in one of the trucks with the army on their way to Berlin. And she included in the picture all these German soldiers who had been killed in the battle that had just taken place along this roadside. And behind the trucks were bodies of German soldiers that the Russians had hung up in the trees. So next slide, please. I wanted to include in this some family photographs, some images. There aren't very many, but I wanted you to see something of what my mother what she looked like as she was experiencing these events that she was describing. So here she is on the left. She was a sergeant in the Polish army by this point, and I believe she was in Germany in this scene. And obviously she was doing well. She was part of the victorious army that had come in. And here she is walking with a friend whose father was a high official in the Russian army. So after this point, she went on to Berlin, and then she went with the army. And then when the war ended, she went back to Poland to get Manya. And the two of them left Poland and went back to Germany to a DP camp, a displaced persons camp or refugee camp Next slide, please. And that's where my mother met my father, who was also a Polish survivor, and they got married in the camp. And I realized I recently learned that the camp had not been established for very long as a DP camp when my parents got married. So they didn't really know each other. They hadn't really known each other for very long when they got married, maybe not more than a few months. But everybody was so eager to get married and start a new life. The camp was filled with young people who had lost nearly everything and were just wanted to reclaim their lives. So my father had relatives in New York, and so he applied for a visa to immigrate to New York. And while they were waiting, my father went to Belgium to find work there. My mother, by this point, was pregnant with me, and he didn't want me to be born in a DP camp. He went, so he left to go to Belgium um, to find some better life while they were waiting for the visa. So they eventually got the visas and they came to New York in 1949. Next slide, please. And here we are, and you can sort of make me out as this little pink thing on my father's shoulder, sleeping on my father's shoulder as we arrived in New York Harbor. And my father's cousin, Clara, who helped get our sponsorship to come to the US, she came to greet us, to meet us. And while we were standing there, while they were standing there, my Clara looked over to me and she said to me, "My dear child, this will be your America." And I was always so struck by the spaciousness, the openness of this picture with the Statue of Liberty, obviously the central figure, and how welcoming America was at that time to our family. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Esther, and you can see she's in front of that very first picture that she did, plus some of the others. And she was so, she did most of all of these pictures, except for the first two. She did all the rest when she was in her 60s. And so for her, it was really legacy to share her memories with her children and her grandchildren. And that's who she did it for. She wasn't thinking about artistic recognition. She was thinking about leaving her memories for her children. Next slide. This is, for those of you who haven't seen it, haven't been there, this is the gallery with the exhibit of Esther and her dream of one loving human family. And the exhibit has been to close to 40 museums and other institutions around the United States, Canada, and Europe. And it had actually been on exhibit at the Visionary Art Museum twice before the current one. But when Rebecca Hofberger, the former and beloved director of the museum, when we talked about bringing the exhibit back, she had this idea of recreating Esther's home in the center of the gallery. And I was just so knocked out by it. It's the most beautiful of all the exhibits, I think, that have been done. And it gives you, some sense of the scale of the artwork too, seeing it in this image. I do hope you get to see it if you haven't already. I do hope you get to see it in person, because as beautiful as the images are in online and in the book that we have and in the film that we have, seeing them in person is really another experience. Next slide, please. I wanted to just share with you a couple of other images from the exhibit of Esther and Her Dream of One Loving Human Family, which includes images from other genocides and other acts of war and violence. This is one by an artist named Lily Ye, who traveled to Rwanda after after the genocide there, and she created this image of this village that she went to. She was invited to come there to help this village figure out how to memorialize the dead that they lost. And so she worked with them to create these public art uh, representations. And this is a painting that she did from that period. I was particularly moved to learn that when she went to Rwanda, she took a copy of our book, of my mother's artwork, with her to share with the villagers there. Next slide, please. This is a story cloth from that was created by a woman in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my husband and I spend our summers. And we did a workshop, as we have done in a number of other places, for families, and in this case, particularly immigrant families, to share their stories inspired by my mother's art and story, to share their own stories of coming to America. And here, Ingrid Smith is the artist's name. She stitched an image of her home that she left in Guatemala, arriving in the center in Santa Fe with her children and experiencing snow for the first time. And in the last two panels, she recalls how after she found work as a preschool teacher and taking care of infants or babies, a man that she met scolded her for taking good jobs from other local people, and how, as an immigrant, she should be working in the fields. And so she decided to honor the campesinos, the field workers, in that top image for the important work that they do. Next slide, please. This is from our website. Actually, this comes from YouTube, but you can find this, you can access it through our website. And it is a video tour that we created, in which I narrate about a minute worth of video film to accompany each of the 36 images. So you can learn more about the entire collection. And there's an introduction, which I narrate as well. And I would just encourage you to explore this video tour. Actually, you can take it with you when you go through the exhibit and get the narration to accompany each of the pictures, or you can just watch it at home. We're really pleased to see how it turned out. Really, really pleased. There's also a film that's playing constantly on a loop in the gallery at the Visionary Art Museum. And you can see it on through our website. It's also on YouTube. So there's a lot of material on the website. Next slide, please. This is a copy of, or the cover of the book that we have. You can, if you're interested, you can purchase it from Amazon through our website, or the gift shop at the Visionary Art Museum also sells it. And then the last slide, um, if you would switch to that, I just want you to have our website, the URL. There's, and I would encourage you to visit the website because there's lots and lots of beautiful, interesting, and educational material on the website, including lesson plans for middle and high school students. So I guess I want to pause here. I want to thank you, first of all, again for joining us this evening and or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. It has again been my pleasure and my honor to be able to share this with you. And so we probably have some questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Bernice, for taking the time. And it is so special to do this on Esther's birthday.
Yeah.
Um, I saw somebody did have a question. How old were your parents when they got married?
My father was older than my father was 12 years older than my mother. So my mother was 19 and my father was 31.
Oh. Um, do you want to talk about the wedding dress? I love that story.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you for asking. Um, so that dress in the camp, I mentioned that everybody was getting married. There was one wedding dress that circulated among all the brides. They would put it on when the photographer was coming so that they uh, had sort of an official looking wedding portrait. But it was just this one dress that everyone, all the women got to wear.
Mhm.
And when my sister got married years ago now, I I reflected and she asked me to make some remarks. And I told the story of this one wedding dress and I reflected on all the hopes and dreams and uh, wishes for the future that must have been embedded in that dress. And that was what I wished them for their marriage too.
Let's see what else. Oh, here's a good question. Did she, when she was looking for fabric for her work, were they like, did she use like old clothing like to get that fabric, or like how did she source her fabric?
Yeah, good question. So some of it was fabric scraps that she had from making whatever. I have a scarf that actually the fabric that she used for her dress in her story of her journey, she used the same fabric for her dress and Manya's dresses uh, through for continuity through that journey. And that sort of turquoise color came from a scarf that she had made for me, which I still have.
Mm.
How could I not have it anymore? But she also had scraps from clothes that she made for my kids, all these beautiful little dresses for my daughter. And so she used those where she could. But then um, she would go through fabric stores, particularly the Joann's fabric near her house, and look
Awesome.
for where she was looking for something very specific, something that she could use for ground cover or dug earth or, some feature of the landscape. Um, and I mentioned
Yeah, she's
the
really good at picking out
curtains that she
textures.
found.
Yeah. hmm Like the textures of the fabrics, she's really good at.
Yeah, yeah, she managed to find patterns that could imitate the texture of what she was representing.
Let's see, another question. On average, how long did it take her to create one of her pieces, would you say?
Yeah, I am often asked that question. Um, it is the most frequently asked question, I think.
I
Um,
would say.
I had to calculate this because, on average, because everything, there were different sizes, different complexity. But on average, over the roughly 10-year period that she was working, she created 34 pictures. So on average, it took her 3 to 4 months for each piece. Obviously, some took longer, some took less.
Great. Let's see here. Oh, here's a good question for you, Bernice. Do you sew or crochet or knit or anything like that?
I learned how to do all those things. And there was a time in my life when I was very crafty and knitting and crocheting in particular a lot. When I got married, my mother gave me a sewing machine, not surprisingly. But I stopped doing all that stuff some years ago. So people ask me often whether I inherited my mother's talent, her stitching talent. And I say my mother's talent was to create all this artwork, and mine was to bring it out into the world.
100%. Um, Somebody mentioned Esther's sister. Could you share a little what her story was?
Well, after the war, so they were both in the refugee camp together. And that's where my aunt met her husband as well, who is also a survivor. But so my parents came to the United States. My aunt and uncle went to Israel. But they came to the United States. My mother always wanted to bring them to the United States. And so um, eventually they came and they moved into an apartment 2 doors away from us. And they were always close after that. So my aunt and uncle moved to Dallas uh, a number of years later. But my mother and aunt talked on the phone. If they didn't see each other, they talked on the phone all the time. It was just, it was embedded in them.
Yeah. Um, let's see. Did Esther ever go back to visit the village where she was from?
Yeah. We went on this family trip in 1999. This was just before my mother got really sick. And it was amazing. It was amazing. It was the first time that she had been there um, since the war.
Yeah.
And we went back to Mnishik. We went back to Grabovka. Well, Mnishik was very disturbing to her because that beautiful river that she depicted in one of the first images had been dammed up somewhere. And so it was not, it was sort of marshy. And also the village was very poor. I mean, it was never a well-to-do village, but when there were Jews living there, there was more of a life to it. And so, and then also 50 years of communism kind of depleted the strength of the people that were left. But we went to Grabovka, the village that saved her. And there my mother saw her friends, women that had been girls, her girlfriends in the village. And they came running to see her when they heard she was there. It was just amazing, just amazing. And you'll see one of the villagers there who my mother reunited with uh, was living in the house that had belonged to Jadek, where my mother had lived during the war. And when she saw my mother, she went back into her house and she came out with this cup, like a porcelain coffee cup that had belonged to Jadek. And it was the cup in which my mother would bring Jadek his coffee every morning. And so my mother begged Chela, this woman's name, begged Chela to let her have the cup because it was the only memento. She had no other, she had nothing else
Mhm.
from that time in her life. So now, after my mother died, it, I I got the cup, and it's now uh, sort of behind me in the museum, next to the picture of the bees, is
Yeah.
a small case, a small box in which the Jadik's cup is displayed.
It's so special that we have, so many personal things in the exhibition, including there's a video of Esther um when you went back to visit, and that just brings the whole thing to life. Just seeing her like laughing and smiling, and she's like milking a cow. I love that.
Which gave her such great pleasure
Yeah,
to get her hands on a cow.
it's so funny. Um, Here's a great observation. Gardens and flowers are in many, nature is featured in almost all of the panels. Did she garden when she moved to the US?
Hmm. Uh, well, one of the pictures that I didn't show was the cherry tree that was in the backyard of the first house that we lived in when we came to the United States. And my mother, as you could tell from her pictures, she was a farm girl. You know, she loved anything that grew and anything that she could make grow. So she saw this tree in the backyard that was all overgrown, but was filled with sour cherries every summer. And she would climb to the top of that tree and send down buckets and buckets of cherries. So she wasn't tending that tree, but she certainly made use of that tree and its delicious fruit. But when we had a chance, when she had a chance to have a little bit of land for a garden, she filled it completely with tomatoes and lettuce and cucumbers and whatever she could grow. So um, she loved the soil, and she loved making things,
Yeah.
creating life from the soil. She was a farm girl.
Mm.
She never she never got that dirt out from under her fingernails, you might say.
That's a good observation.
Figuratively, not literally.
Um, let's see. Did Esther ever mention if these creating these pieces was healing for her? Did she ever talk about anything like that?
You know, it's a really wonderful question. Um, she she never thought about it as therapy. I mean, she never expressed that as a reason, as a rationale for what she was doing. As I said earlier, she was thinking of this only as a way to share her memories, to preserve her memories of her family, the family that she lost, and pass them on to the family that she created, because she had nothing else of the family that she lost
Mm.
but her memories. And so being able to keep her memories and to pass them on was what her motivation was. But of course, I think in doing that, I think that was in itself therapeutic. It was, in the film, one of the psychologists that we interviewed on camera talked about the act of stitching and putting the needle through the fabric, pushing it in, taking it out, just this very gentle and repetitive motion, how how healing that could be. Just it's sort of a meditative um,
Yeah.
act, and I think that was very true. I think it was very, it was a way for my mother to um, cope with, in a very concrete way, for her to cope with the power of the memories that she had held.
Um,
Yeah, I think things that you make with your hands can be very healing. Um, one time I was giving a tour of the exhibit, and there was a boy in the group who was, I don't know, maybe 10 or something like that. And he said, what I like about your mother's pictures is that I can see her hand in it,
mm,
which I thought was a great observation.
yeah,
Um, to be able to connect with my mother, her hand is present. It's a piece of her.
yeah.
Obviously, it comes from her head and her heart, but it also comes from her hand. And that's very visible in a stitched work.
I have a question, Bernice. Do you have a piece that's your favorite?
This is like asking a parent.
I know. I knew you were gonna say that.
Well, I have a couple of pieces that I particularly love, I think, because, it's hard to just pick one, only one. But the piece that I showed, oh, well, I didn't show it today. Well, the piece that I showed of what I call heaven and hell, of the girls on the one side of the picture with their cows by the good pasture, and then the slave labor camp
Right.
on the other side. Uh, I think I think of it as iconic in the sense that to me it captures the essence of war from the perspective of a girl and a victim of war. There was another picture which I didn't show. I'm just wondering if I can quickly pull it
Oh,
up, or how quickly I could pull it up. Um, well, it's the picture with the blue border in which those of you who, well, this will give you, those of you who have seen it might remember it. Those of you who haven't might have a destination now. It's the picture, a from a memory from before the war, of a Jewish holiday called Shavuos or Shavuot. It has a blue border in which she stitched, and the only one in which she actually stitched in the border. Oh, sorry. Meant to turn off my phone earlier. And there's just the color. So it's a scene where she is walking on a pair of stilts with her brother and sisters, and she's on the stilts, and they're all following her, and they're going through a field of wheat. And the wheat is so beautiful. And it's this brilliant gold, and the border is this beautiful blue. And so the pairing of those two colors, I think, is so uh, gorgeous. And the way in which she remembers herself on a pair of stilts, standing head and shoulders above her brother and sisters, and leading the way, I thought was just a beautiful um, way in which she
mm,
remembered herself. And it was so characteristic of her character. So I guess those two pictures, in a way, are the most, I have a special feeling
yeah,
about them, but there are others too. But those two come to mind.
yeah. I just dropped in the chat last call for questions if anyone has any. more questions for Bernice. Time to ask.
I just want to, I noticed someone named Beth, uh, because Beth, you had a number of comments. And I just want to say thank you for your comments and questions. And I really appreciate how engaged you were with the presentation. It was wonderful. My
Thank
pleasure. My
you.
pleasure.
Um,
I also just saw the sort of fragment of a comment from a teacher, I guess,
mhm.
who mentioned that she was going to share the materials. Did I read
Yep.
that correctly?
Mhm. Yes.
Um,
Looks like eighth grade. Their eighth grade teacher.
oh, good, Beth. Uh, so these materials are perfect for middle school students, and um, that's K. I don't know what K stands for, but um, where are you? Anyway, um, I think I've done a number of programs for middle school and high school students. In fact, I just did a program for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was the week before last, I guess, um, in for the Montgomery County, Maryland public school system, in which there were 700 kids that had signed on. It was a webinar,
Oh,
and that is just fantastic. So I think, and we got a great response from a number of students. I think the because it's visual and because it's beautiful, it's very inviting and engaging for young people. And of course, my mother was their age when she had these experiences. So it's very relatable. Well, to the extent that these a war can be relatable to our kids. But anyway, I think that the themes that are um, that emerge from the materials, and we have the film, which is a 30-minute film. We have the book. We have the video tour. Um, and we have a series of very rich lesson plans all on our website. So I would really encourage those of you who are teachers or work with students to look through all of that and make use of it. And I in the last slide, the very last slide, I think I have my email address, maybe not. But
I'm not
I guess what I want to um, share with you, yeah, is you can contact me through, and I would invite you, for any of you who have questions or observations, whatever, to contact me through the website. There's a contact feature there. So I would love to
sure.
hear from you. No, it's not
And if,
artandremembrance.com. It's
oh,
artandremembrance.org.
that's because all my windows are hiding this slide. Sorry. Um, I'll get that right link. I also would say if you're local, you know, your students should come to the museum and check it out. And we can do a story cloth program. We have one tomorrow. So we're always showing students the work and having them create projects inspired by your mother's work, which is just amazing.
And as you know, Becca, I so um, appreciate and am thrilled at the partnership that we have and the way in which together we're bringing Esther's art and story to students and the community, the communities.
Absolutely. Yeah. Get in touch if anyone wants to host a program with us or with Bernice. We're here. And
Yeah.
how long will the exhibit be here? That was a question that I saw as well.
The exhibit is now on long-term loan, so it will be at the museum till 2030 for another well, almost 6 years. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So,
so
and we're thrilled to
exciting.
have it there.
Beth has a question that I think I can answer. Bernice, do you have any pieces hanging in your home? And I would say no, they're all in the museum.
That is true. I actually had one piece um, for a while. My mother made a small portrait of her mother,
Mm.
uh, just from the one single photograph that she had of her mother. And so that one uh, I had hanging in my house for a while. But when we did this exhibit, um, I loaned it to include in the exhibit. So I have nothing of my mother's artwork in my house. But my whole goal in once I saw what my mother was creating, my whole goal became getting all the artwork, which she would give to me when she was done with each piece. My goal was to get it out of my house and into the world. So I feel very gratified that we've been able to accomplish that.
Well, and we are also grateful for you, for doing that, for being able to share that story with everyone. Um,
Yeah, it's
that's
great. I just
yeah.
did want to mention that although I don't have any of my mother's pieces, my son had created a an image, a photographic image of the very first piece, which he framed and is now hanging in his house. And my sister had a photographic image uh, created, well, produced to replace the original of the one that she used to have in her house for many years. So there are photographic images that linger in our homes, just not the originals anymore. But as I say this, I remember my sister has one
Oh,
that my mother made as a duplicate. And, my mother made two pictures of the coming to America.
oh, I
And
didn't know that.
the second one is going to be in a show at the DAR Museum opening this spring. The Daughters of the American Revolution is having a show on women and work. It sounds like a fantastic exhibit. I'm really interested in seeing it. And of course, I'm really interested in the fact that they're interested in having one of Esther's pieces in at that museum, which to me seems so um, it's the Daughters of the American Revolution. So formal and well, I would say stodgy. Um, but it sounds like a great effort to bring it into the 21st century and widen its audience.
Absolutely. Let's see. Here's one more quick question. Maybe not quick. How did it end up at the AVAM? Or sorry, how did Esther's work end up at the AVAM?
Um, through a sort of a mutual friends and acquaintances, the work came to Rebecca Hofberger's attention. And um, some of you may actually know Rebecca or have met her, the former founder, and director of the museum, who is kind of brilliant and the visionary in Visionary Art Museum. And she wanted to include the work in an exhibit at the museum that was opening in October 2001. So it was, and the theme of that exhibit was the art of war and peace, which was amazingly prescient for 9/11, after 9/11. So this exhibit opened on the heels of 9/11. It was stunning. And Rebecca included 9 pieces of my mother's in that exhibit. And then after that, she brought the whole exhibit to the museum. And then and she brought it back again and that was 2003. And then she brought it back again in 2011. And
Yeah.
now this time. So this is uh, like really a very woven into the museum's I don't know what to call it, blood.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, even when it was not at the AVAM, I would get a call once a week asking where it was, I swear. And so it's part of, yeah, it's just like intertwined with the museum now, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we love AVAM. And for those of you who haven't voted, please
Oh,
let the world know that AVAM is your favorite museum.
yeah, we're nominated for the USA Today poll.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah. Well, Bernice, I want to thank you so much for your time this evening. For those of you who put comments in the chat for Bernice, I will share the transcript with her in case she missed one. Um, so yeah, thank you again for joining us. Check out our website for more upcoming virtual programs and in-person programs. And please come and see the exhibit. We're open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And again, if you want to share this, we are recording it and we'll get it on our YouTube as soon as possible. And be sure to check out Art and Remembrance's YouTube as well. Okay.
yeah. Thank you
So
again. Thank you so much.
thanks, everyone. We hope to see you soon.